My name is Royce, and this is the Beginner's Guide to Pauper. Pauper is a fast and efficient Magic format, and my favorite way to play the game. But it's also extremely accessible because all of the cards are commons, which means some of the best decks are only about 50 bucks. In each video in this series, I'll explain one of these decks, and what makes it tick. So whether you want general overviews, card-by-card analysis, or even sideboard and mulligan advice, I got you. So let's get your journey started. Which do you think is better? To fight bravely for the win, or to ensure that you cannot lose? This is a question that has plagued politicians, casinos, and even Magic the Gathering players for untold millennia, but with today's deck, you can do both. Mono Blue Terror is a tempo-oriented strategy that aims to quickly fill its graveyard, slam huge threats, and present lethal damage. But unlike the honest and frankly naive Gruul decks, Terror packs sneaky counter magic, meant to catch the opponent off guard and protect its win condition. While there are several Terror decks in the Pauper metagame, we'll focus today on the Mono Blue variant, the fastest of them all. Let's see what we're working with. I'll cover the most important cards that belong in almost every Mono Blue Terror deck. We'll start off the deck tech with threats. These are the beefy boys that we use to apply pressure and win the game. Let's face it, the deck simply wouldn't be Mono Blue Terror without the snake monster itself. Tolarian Terror may look like a lowly 7-mana 5/5 at first glance, but it can be discounted to as low as 1 blue mana if the graveyard is full of instants and sorceries. It should go without saying, a 1-mana 5/5 with built-in protection from its ward ability is certainly a force to be reckoned with. Cryptic Serpent is like Terror's little brother. Still horrifying, but a bit easier to manage. It can't go below 2 mana, and it lacks the other snake's powerful ward ability, but it's still a 6/5 that you can drop for 2. Despite the downsides I mentioned, we still usually play a full playset of this thing. On to the last core threat. When I first got into Magic, I was flabbergasted to hear that Delver of Secrets ruled Legacy, a notoriously powerful format. At least I was until I played against it. This thing strikes fear into the hearts of many when it drops on turn 1, especially when it flips into this monstrosity on the very next turn. Delver's flip condition even synergizes with the rest of the deck, since we already want to fill it with instants and sorceries. By the way, you might think this card is balanced by the random element involved in its transform condition, but it's actually super easy. Barely an inconvenience. We'll get to that in a moment. Honestly, that about does it for our threats. There aren't many, but they hit hard. Now let's go over our favorite way to find the cards we need while also tossing stuff into the graveyard as quickly as possible. Cantrip is a word of Scots origin, referring to a witch's trick or illusion. Back in 1995, Magic designers adopted the term cantrip to refer to cheap spells with minimal effects that draw a card. Cantrips enable consistent strategies, giving us more chances to find whatever we need. Since many cantrips are instants and sorceries, they also help us to power out our threats. Brainstorm is the first of these, and it's literally the glue that holds Mono Blue Terror together. Draw 3 cards, return 2 does net you just 1 card, but it has a ton of interesting applications. For one thing, there's card selection, keeping the best cards and throwing back the worst ones. It can also hide your best card on the top of the deck in response to the opponent's attempted discard effects. But it goes further. With Brainstorm, we can almost always guarantee a Delver flip by putting an instant or sorcery on top of the library. But this leads us to a conundrum. What happens if we cast Brainstorm, find nothing, and then slowly redraw the 2 cards we just put back? Nothing good. That's part of the strength of our next 2 cantrips, Thought Scour and Mental Note. These cards both mill the top 2 of the deck before drawing. This would already let us cheat out our snakes by filling up the graveyard, but it also helps us break a Brainstorm lock. These cantrips do draw cards per se, but each one just replaces itself, meaning they don't actually increase the amount of tools at our disposal. But thankfully, Mono Blue Terror still has a few ways to deal with that problem. One common mistake from new players is to treat Mono Blue Terror like a value-oriented control deck. That's not how it works. Usually we're the aggressor, and we couldn't care less how many cards we have left when they're dead. With that said, we still have a few ways to recoup card advantage for that extra bit of gas. Lorien Revealed does technically fit the bill for card advantage, since it draws 3 cards for 5 mana, And this does come up on occasion, creating a huge value swing, but that's not really where it shines. Lorien's island cycling ability, on the other hand, honestly does everything. It helps to hit land drops in a spell-heavy deck, it loads the graveyard to speed out snakes, and it even breaks brainstorm locks. This is one of the best blue cards in Pauper, period. Lorien Revealed might have been filed under card advantage as a technicality, but the inclusion of Deep Analysis could not be any clearer. Given enough time, this spell can net 3 cards, even more than Lorien. Its flashback ability also gives it extra value in the graveyard, so it's a big high roll to mill this card with Thought Scour or Mental Note. While Deep Analysis is the classic choice, some players have started gravitating towards Frantic Inventory or Accumulated Knowledge instead. These spells ramp up over the course of the game, eventually drawing as many as 4 cards for just 2 mana. Even if reaching that point is a bit unrealistic, their instant speed still gives them more flexibility than the sorcery speed Deep Analysis. They just tend to have a bit less impact on average. Now we've discussed how to find and enable our threats. But what do we do after that? Just drop them on the board and hope they survive? Thankfully, we have more tricks up our sleeves. Our best point of interaction is Counterspell, the OG counter magic from back in MTG's alpha days. It's simple, strong, and in a mono blue shell, we won't have too much trouble casting it. We can use it offensively to force through our own game plan, or defensively in a pinch to fizzle anything the opponent might have going on. Spell Pierce is a great early game option to interrupt non-creature setup spells. Among other decks, it's a major thorn in the side of Affinity and a Brood Scale. However, its power drops off quickly in the late game when it becomes trivial to pay the extra 2 mana, so try to use it while you can. Boomerang is a classic soft removal spell that represents flexibility and tempo because it can bounce any permanent back to hand, including a land. In many cases, this can slow the opponent down enough to warrant the loss of card advantage. With that said, if you're more of a value-oriented gamer, there is another way. Demon Inferior can spin a creature back to the opponent's deck for as low as just 1 mana. However, its higher maximum mana cost, limitation to creatures, and sorcery speed make this more of a side grade than a strictly better option. So far, I've only explained the core cards that belong in almost every mono blue Terra deck. So let's take a quick moment to discuss some of the most popular choices to fill the 6 or so remaining flex slots, gauntlet style. A 16th island can help prevent getting mana screwed. Ponder and Consider let you do more cantripping with some card selection, graveyard setup, and brainstorm lock breaking. Artful Dodge, Sleep of the Dead, and Dragon Wings can all provide closing power from the graveyard. Murmuring Mystic is a slow creature that can seal the mirror or fairy matchup. Force Spike, Dispel, and Lose Focus are all counter magic for different metagames, and Echoing Truth is a pseudo sweeper against token decks. Now that you know what the cards do, let's talk about how an average game with Mono Blue Terror might actually unfold. In the early game, you have 3 main jobs: hitting land drops, finding snakes, and filling up the graveyard. In fact, you'll spend most of your time around now just dropping lands and casting cantrips. Since so many of our cards are instant speed, that means you can sometimes threaten interaction and hold the opponent hostage. If they don't bite though, just spend that mana to cast more cantrips or cycle Lorien Revealed. During this phase, by the way, it's usually okay to tap below Counterspell, especially if it means you're setting up a more aggressive line with Delver of Secrets. In the mid-game, release the snakes! If everything goes according to plan, turning them sideways will spell defeat for your opponent. This is where counter magic and removal can really come in clutch, to maintain board control and keep them on the back foot in the face of your Serpentine Horde. The late game isn't something we love to see, since we can easily start to fizzle out in the later turns. Your best shot at recovery might be to draw 3 with Lorien Revealed, or else to flood the board with Murmuring Mystic. Also, if the opponent's life total is low, it's a good time to try to cheese out the win with something like a Sleep of the Dead or Artful Dodge. Now that we've covered what the cards do and Mono Blue Terra's general game plan, I think it's time to discuss the sideboard. In my last video, The Beginner's Guide to Grixis Affinity, a lot of you requested a sideboard guide, and while I don't think this video is the right place for something extremely exhaustive like a spreadsheet, we can still go over some very popular choices and talk about a few pointers. The first chunk of the sideboard, especially if you play online, has to be anti-red. Red aggro or Kuldotha has great ways to swarm the board and present burn damage, so we need efficient ways to interrupt what they're doing on the first few turns. This is one of the few matchups where we operate more as a control deck during games 2 and 3. In this matchup, we should take out Delvers, which gets sniped by removal, as well as evasive spells and a few of our slower options. The next chunk of the sideboard is Affinity Hate. If we're armed with a Null and Steel Sabotage, as well as a few Spell Pierce or Dispel, we'll be well equipped to hold them down. Bounce spells and evasive spells aren't great in this matchup and can be safely removed. By the way, this Affinity Hate also improves our matchups against other decks that rely on artifacts and enchantments, like Boros Synthesizer or Bogles. For the last 5 slots or so, players have different opinions on the best inclusions. Based on results from recent Pauper leagues, the most common choices are Board Interaction to bounce or tap down opposing creatures, Counter Magic to interrupt various different strategies, and Murmuring Mystic to help against the blue decks. But at the end of the day, if you tailor the rest of your sideboard to your local metagame, you should be golden. Before we continue, I want to leave you with 3 pieces of advice when it comes to sideboarding. Number 1, what to bring in is usually pretty obvious. You should probably spend more time thinking about what to cut. Number 2, make sure your changes don't weaken your deck. Usually you want to stay aggressive with Mono Blue Terror, so don't water down your game plan more than you have to. And number 3, generally, when you go first, you're the aggressor. When you go second, you're the disruptor. To avoid getting too in the weeds on that topic, I'll link an article from Channel Fireball down in the description. Another highly requested segment from the Affinity video was a mulligan guide. I think this is where I'm supposed to pretend that my mulligans aren't based purely on vibes, so I'll try to offer some advice. A keepable hand with Mono Blue Terror consists of a few different things. 2 to 3 lands, including Lorien Revealed, either a creature or a way to find one, and a method to start filling the graveyard. This should enable the ideal play pattern of dropping a snake on turn 3 or 4. In some matchups, especially post-sideboard, counter magic might also enter the mix, but I personally rarely hard mulligan for counters if I've already opened up with an aggressive start. The vague recommendation that a good opening hand has lands and spells is not always accurate. I would almost never keep a hand that includes 3 islands, 2 Tolarian Terrors, and 2 counter spells. Even though it has a balanced mixture of card types, it doesn't offer the proactivity that the deck needs. Depending on the matchup, I would also keep a hand with Delver of Secrets and 1 island if I'm going first, especially if I also have additional ways to hunt for those next few lands. Now that we've covered all of the basics, let's discuss the pros and cons of Mono Blue Terror before you buy into the deck for yourself. I think I'll sum up the pros by calling this deck balanced, but what does balanced mean anyway? Well, in terms of power level, Mono Blue Terror is a tier 1 or 2 mainstay that has stood tall despite various different shakeups to the metagame. It's also not broken enough for any of its key cards to be banned anytime soon. In terms of playstyle, it threads the needle between aggression and interaction, so it can be enjoyed by a variety of different players. In terms of difficulty, it's fairly straightforward, but it still offers opportunities for improvement, like early sequencing, countering the right card, and knowing when to tap out. Unfortunately, being simple also comes at a cost. A combat-only win con of swinging with similarly sized creatures over and over might not be some players' idea of dynamic gameplay. Like all Magic colors, blue also does some things well and other things not very much at all, so mono blue decks can be a bit narrow. In this deck, for example, it lacks very much hard removal or sweeper options, so it suffers against already developed board states. But still, setting all of that aside, Mono Blue Terror's power and simplicity still make it one of the very best decks to start off your Pauper journey. Before you go, let me send you off with some additional resources, which I'll either link on the screen or down in the description. I actually have a shameless plug to start off. A Mono Blue Terror deck was actually my very first video on the channel. In that video, I entered a tournament with Demon Inferior to see how it compared to Boomerang. To improve with Mono Blue Terror, I also watched This League from Stratagames, a longtime Magic YouTuber who has awesome recap analysis. And just last week, I discovered this channel from Alessandro Piracini, the champion of Paupergeddon, where he uploaded a league with Mono Blue Terror. If you want to follow the best around, here are the names of some Magic players who've had strong recent performances with the deck. You can find out more by searching their names on MTG Goldfish. And finally, to learn more, check out the Discord servers linked in the description, and to get plugged into the Pauper community, check out r/Pauper on Reddit. That about does it for today's beginner's guide to Mono Blue Terror. But let me know down in the comments, is there a Pauper deck that you want to see me cover next? And remember, if you like this series and want to see more Pauper content just like this, a like and a subscription to the channel would both be amazing. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.